Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I've heard that the traffic all over the city is just a jam as everybody tries to get here for this event tonight. So we will have some stragglers, I'm sure, including my parents, my kids. But anyway, I'm sure they're not just delaying on purpose. They all want to be here. And so I appreciate you all coming. My name is Jane Varner Malhotra. I work here at Georgetown, and I will add that the reason I work here at Georgetown is because somebody gave me wise counsel about 4 years ago when I got a job offer for something that I didn't think I wanted. And that was my Aunt Anne. And she said, oh, you know, the medical center at Georgetown is full of people who are in the helping profession. And you'll love writing their stories and writing the stories of the medical alumni who learned at this institution. And she really planted the seed for what I realized was a soul calling. And so I'm sure she did that for a lot of people in this room in her quiet way. And so before I take up any more time, I just want to make sure we have plenty of time for everyone else. So again, thanks for coming. And I will add that it happens to be her birthday today. So this is Anne's birthday party. And afterwards, we have a little reception and a bar, and I don't know if we have the budget for it, but now it's being recorded, so we'll work all that out later. But I want to introduce Anne's colleague and peer, Julia Lamm. She's a professor in the Department of Theology here at Georgetown, and Anne introduced me to Julia many years ago on the hill outside of Holy Trinity Donut Hour. So that's really where a lot of great relationships begin. And so without further ado, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. It's a great honor to be here tonight and to be able to moderate this. I met Anne relatively late, although her name was always there. She was ahead of me at the University of Chicago. We both have Minnesota roots, and so I knew of her work with other colleagues at Carleton College. So when I was finally able to meet her and to befriend her and to have lunch with her when she was coming here for treatments, it was really a great honor. We're going to begin this evening with a benediction from Father Leo J. O'Donovan. But let me first say a few words about Leo. After graduating from Georgetown University, Leo O'Donovan entered the Society of Jesus, earned advanced degrees in philosophy and theology from Fordham University and Woodstock College, and was ordained to the priesthood in 1966. Under the direction of Karl Rahner, he earned his doctorate degree at the University of Münster in 1971 and subsequently taught at Woodstock College, Union Theological Seminary, and Weston Jesuit School of Theology. He served as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and in fact, I think this room is full of former presidents. And in 1989 was elected as the 47th president of Georgetown University and served in that capacity until 2001. Currently, he serves as director of mission at Jesuit Refugee Services, USA. Leo?
Thank you, Julia. And I'm very glad there's a reception afterwards because the CTSA never meets without having drinks. Come, Spirit of God, gather us here together to remember and to invoke and to celebrate one of your wonders. Born in the old Georgetown Hospital, just down the hill from where we now sit, Anne Estelle Patrick was the eldest of 6 sisters, grew up happily in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and entered the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary in 1958 to become a sister. It was not until 1969 that she completed her BA, in 1982 her doctorate at the University of Chicago. Who can say it better than Charlie Curran? She was a gentle woman with a spine of steel. Anne was, as a friend recently wrote me, a woman of grace in every way. To know her was to love her. Her graceful writing, nurtured by her love of literature, matched a commitment to precision with passion for the truth. She took her love of literature and brought it into her work in ethics. Aesthetics arrived in moral theology via Anne, says Jim Keenan. The narrative replaced the case. And her profound respect for every human person never allowed the person to be seen alone, but always rather in community. Her very method, says Beth Johnson, was rooted in a profound reverence for the human person and the person's experience, seeing in this the work of the Spirit of God. She saw the person in a social context rather than as a freestanding individual, so her analysis focused on a whole, large picture. She became, of course, a feminist moral theologian, but fully in practice as well as in theory, addressing some of the most sensitive issues on the Catholic docket, sensitively. Conscience was a particular center of her concern, and Charlie Curran goes so far as to say that important as was Bernard Herring's insistence that conscience must be free and faithful, Anne's understanding of conscience as a creatively responsible self is a more helpful understanding. It was H. Richard Niebuhr's influence, deepened by her own personal experience. She likewise held a finely crafted position on prophecy, living it for others to see, but speaking also hopefully of the planned obsolescence of the feminist agenda when equality had been achieved. She could be optimistic. Many of us here have favorite stories about Anne. One of mine is our speaking on the phone the night we learned that Anne Carr had died. We were both deeply distressed. She wisely reminded me of a poem by Emily Dickinson, and I found myself saying, Anne, you know, I've loved you for many years, but tonight, across the miles to Minnesota, I love you more than ever before. It was for me the beginning of an experience of Pentecost unique in my life. But a still more favorite and public memory is of Anne in 1967 making a 30-day Ignatian retreat and reading the documents of Vatican II in the Walter Abbott translation. The book was the first she had possessed since 1958 that spoke so directly to her life and aspirations. And she felt emboldened, though deeply schooled in the poverty of her community, emboldened to underline the passages she most wanted to return to. The paperback book cost 95 cents, and she had not yet completed her BA. One of the most charming essays in the collection we consider tonight, giving the book as a whole its title, On Being Unfinished, De Imperfectione. It speaks immediately to each of us in this room, I think, as Anne reflects on a beloved image showing two Navajo women weaving a rug. How lovely, she muses, is the work in its making itself, not only in what, with many more hours of labor, it could come to be. But let me call attention to a further sense of the beautifully unfinished, not simply in the process, but in its final state. For, since the Renaissance, work that an artist, think Donatello or Michelangelo, considered finished, even though it may look incomplete, has been praised as non finito. Michelangelo so signed his first Pietà. In our beloved Anne Patrick, who believed that theology and art each required the other, we have a patron saint for such graced daughters and sons of God. Here she is, invisibly among us, this patron saint of the non-finito, a life that Anne herself, I feel confident, modestly deemed incomplete, but whom God, through her spirit of wisdom, reveals to us now as perfected in glory. We dance here? Where do you want me to go?
Right there.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Leo. Next, Heather Dubrow. She is currently the John D. Boyd S.J. Chair in the Poetic Imagination at Fordham University. Isn't that a wonderful title? I love it. Among the institutions at which she previously taught are Carleton College, where she and Ann Patrick were colleagues for a decade, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Among her publications are 7 single-authored books, a co-edited collection of essays, and an edition of As You Like It. Also a poet, she is the author of a collection of her own lyrics and of poems in numerous journals. Please welcome Heather Dubrow.
Thank you, and let me, before I do my presentation, start by thanking the 2 principal obstetricians of this book. First, Mary Patrick Garrity, who's done so much in this and other ways to keep Anne's legacy alive, and Susan Perry, the editor with whom I was honored to work and from whom I learned so much. Since Anne Patrick was one of my closest friends for 36 years, until her death in 2016, my description of her book will be, so to speak, bookended with some personal anecdotes. I first met Anne early in the fall of 1980 at a Carleton College reception that we both attended as new faculty members. Noticing her wedding ring, I asked if her husband had been able to move to Northfield with her. And I'm afraid I even added, and has he found a job here? Okay. Exemplifying characteristics that I came to learn were very typical of her, and ensured that our friendship began not on the awkward embarrassment my untoward questions might well have provoked, but rather on mutual understanding and respect. With a twinkle in her eye, she explained that she was a nun, but immediately crafted a brief lesson in theology by adding that she saw the ring not as a symbol of a marriage to Christ, but rather of her commitment to the church. Only many years later did I realize that what she didn't say then was as revealing as what she did say. Although both her scholarly knowledge of the long-standing associations of the term nun and her political commitment to change in the church led her to prefer the term woman religious. She clearly recognized that a talk with a new acquaintance was not the moment to introduce those topics. Thus, her responses at that event reflected several intertwined qualities to which I'll return more systematically shortly. The warmth and humor that were indeed characteristic of her as both person and scholar, the ability to teach effectively, and indeed she taught me so much about her church over those years. And finally, her awareness that successful teaching and so much else are related to how and when issues should be raised. It's another tribute to Anne's warmth and openness that we soon became very close friends despite our very different backgrounds and situations. Most obviously, she was devoting her life to her church. While raised to respect other people's faith, I was not raised in any of my own. And when I first met her, I wore no ring myself because of a very recent and very messy divorce. In my newly single state, I had relationships with several men during my years at Carleton and found that I could talk as readily about those relationships to Anne as to any of my secular friends. I was concerned about maintaining our friendship when I left Carleton for another job 10 years later. But with that warmth and equally characteristic efficiency, she soon initiated a steady stream of postcards supplemented by visits whenever we were near each other and occasional phone calls that ensured the continuation of our closeness. For all these reasons, I was honored when her biological sister Mary invited me to write introductions to each of the essays in the book, and a few characteristics of the literary ones soon emerged. Her doctoral thesis, completed during busy semesters of teaching and administration at Carleton, engaged with Niebuhr and literature, and its interest in interdisciplinary approaches in general, and literature in particular, are manifest not only in the 4 essays here, explicitly on literary texts, but also on references to literature throughout the volume. For example, the title of one of the final chapters here is based on a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Indeed, she demonstrates the value of that interdisciplinarity by both precept and example in an essay entitled Imaginative Literature and the Renewal of Moral Theology. Another characteristic of these writings on literature is an originality and independence that also marks her work more explicitly devoted to moral theology. For example, she proposes a very fresh reading of a character in one of George Eliot's novels who is, she suggests, often misread or neglected by other critics. Similarly, in one essay, while fully respecting the contributions of feminist and post-colonial studies, she also alludes to their potential risks at a moment when doing so was rare indeed. Speaking of things that are rare, I think it's rare for people to have to stand in a door, so please come and get seats. As that suggests, Anne Patrick's studies of literature also reflect an openness to complexities, often reflected in what we've already heard, understanding contradictory viewpoints, and often manifest in her insistence on listening to all sides. This commitment, to which I'll return from a wider perspective shortly, generates balanced, qualified evaluations of even sympathetic characters like Eliot's Dorothea. For throughout this group of essays, Anne Patrick repeatedly and characteristically rejects the temptation to read literary texts selectively, even distortedly, to support a pre-existing agenda, a temptation all too common when people in other fields turn to literature for their own ends, and not, of course, unknown even or especially among specialists in the field like myself. As I said before, her essays on literature demonstrate approaches that recur throughout the book, and indeed throughout her whole career. So I'll broaden my discussion now, if I may, by tracing 3 characteristics in particular that we find on Being Unfinished. First, the dovetailing of openness with the ability to reach conclusions, again, which we've already heard about in a way. Second, her commitment to the concept of challenges. And third, her practicality in many senses of the term. The first member of this triad is something to which I've already gestured. Anne Patrick had a gift for understanding a range of perspectives on fraught issues while not shying away from final judgments. For example, much of her career was devoted to opposing, while also working within, a church hierarchy often unsympathetic at best to the feminist issues that concerned her so deeply. By the way, in one conversation with me, she wryly observed that she resisted patriarchy by resisting her father's firm advice that she not go into the church at the tender age of 17, but did so by entering a patriarchal institution. Yet in one of her essays, she says that hierarchy is not necessarily bad, and proceeds to lay out the ways it can be positive, as well as its dangers. This openness to varying perspectives is also manifest in how she navigates some of the most tense issues in the church. Witness, for example, the respect for the opposition to abortion that she expresses in one essay, while also justifying her alternative position. To put it another way, Anne Patrick devoted much of her life to what one of these essays describes as an egalitarian feminist perspective for decision-making. All sides must listen to each other. But I observed earlier that this sympathy towards many interpretations and values, including some quite foreign to her, does not lead her to establish indeterminacy as a desirable or inevitable norm. My deep respect for Charles Curran was temporarily shaken when I heard him describe Anne as gentle, but the firm backbone counterbalances that. On many issues, Anne was indeed firm. In particular, she recognized with sympathy the sources of many types of prejudice, while resolutely opposing them. She was, very characteristically, ahead of her time when writing on an issue to which a member of the panel has devoted much of his work, anti-Islamic prejudice, as well as prejudice against other religions, in an essay as early as 1994. Witness to her insistence that religion and spirituality should not be perceived as opposites. Over the years, I occasionally speculated on how this amalgam of acknowledging a range of opinions, but finally presenting a solution, was related to her faith. Shall recall, for example, that in referring to her interchanges with her Protestant colleagues at Carleton on both theological and daily educational and administrative decisions, she observed that their decisions, their comments, often concluded on indeterminacy, while she believed, and suggested that her Catholicism had encouraged her to believe, that on many issues one had to struggle a long time and consider many alternatives, but at the end a truth would and should emerge. If then this practice of considering a range of options but finally arriving at one is the first central characteristic of these essays, thinking in terms of challenges is the second. Anne characteristically transformed what could have been frustrations into challenges. For example, while celebrating the promisingly progressive statements in that influential document, Gaudium et Spem, she also identifies its gendered biases and discusses ways of addressing them. And as the book testifies, this emphasis on challenges also emerged in more personal situations. In her essay on the ceremony of anointing, she frames her cancer diagnosis as, say, how to respond well to adversity is the challenge I now face. And I heard her use that same vocabulary when describing medical treatments, even the last-ditch participation in a drug trial to which she had such a bad reaction. But a reaction, she told me with her usual generosity, that led those running the trial to modify it for future participants. This book also testifies directly and indirectly to challenges throughout her life. While one deeply respects her work teaching K-12 students, I think one of the most important works anyone can take on, for over a decade, arguably it was not the best use of her own gifts. She once observed to me that she learned belatedly that she had done extremely well in her community's version of a college education, well enough to indicate to any objective observer that further education and a career facilitating significant and cutting-edge intellectual work in theology might well be called for. But she was not told until much later that, lest it encourage pride. And of course, the position of women in the church when she entered her community at the age of 17 made a career in moral theology almost unthinkable. These essays demonstrate how triumphantly Anne Patrick vanquished those challenges too. In addition to her commitment to balancing a range of viewpoints with final conclusions and thinking in terms of challenges, the essays in this book demonstrate a third characteristic to which I've already referred in passing, a pragmatic acuity about what could be achieved and how and when. Her description of effective prophecy as, quote, the balancing act of collaboration, courage, and prudence. Collaboration, courage, and prudence could aptly be borrowed to gloss the essays in this book and the life's work that generated them. This pragmatism is explicit in one of her essays. She defines her primary field, moral theology, in terms that will be familiar to many members of this audience, the branch of Christian ethics concerned with the practical implications. Her pragmatism and practicality were manifest in her astute awareness of time and place. while advocating throughout her life and writings for the reforms of which she was deeply invested, she also recognized that many of them could not be achieved in the short run and had to be left unfinished. She once observed to me that during certain periods, the church was so conservative that the wisest course was to keep one's head low for a while. And she recognized that one had to decide on which issues to fight hardest and in what ways. I remember, for example, her telling me that in deciding when and how to address certain controversies, she asked herself, is this an issue on which I want to risk needing to leave my calling and even perhaps my church? A risk that she took on occasion deliberately and deliberatively in all senses of those adverbs. Her pragmatism also led her to identify its manifestations in others. Very early in the current Pope's pontificate, she suggested that he adopted certain stands in order to pave the way for, lay the groundwork for, more radical approaches when the time was right. Subsequently, other observers repeated and confirmed Anne's early analysis on this. But having opened on anecdotes, let me conclude on a personal one as well. Like many members of her community, she generally resided independently of it. But one year at Carleton, she did live in a house with other women religious, and she invited me to have dinner with them. Frankly, at one point, I looked around the table at the 15 or so women there and thought most of them probably entered their religious communities quite young. Chances are they've had little, if any, sexual experience. How odd. And then I immediately thought, but Heather, you've had no personal religious experience. How odd. And who is to say which of you? Thank you, and thank you, Anne, for so much, including modeling religious experience and values by both precept and example.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So David Hollenbach, S.J., is the Pedro Arrupe Professor at the Walsh School of Foreign Service and Senior Fellow of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. His teaching and research deal with human rights, religious and ethical responses to humanitarian crises, and religion and political life from the standpoint of Catholic social thought and theology. His books include Driven from Home, Protecting the Rights of Forced Migrants, and The Common Good and Christian Ethics. He has taught often at Hekima University College in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm really happy to be able to call him a colleague here at Georgetown. David?
Thank you very much, Julia. It's a real privilege for me to be able to be part of a panel discussing the work of Anne Carr. We were friends, not close friends, but friends who got to know one another over the years through the work of the Catholic Theological Society of America. I remember a very vivid experience that I had just about 2 years ago when the Catholic Theological Society was holding its annual convention in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And as I was the president-elect of the society at that time, and had been president of it previously before I was. I had been involved in planning the conference, and I ran into Anne just as it was beginning. And all I can remember her telling me was, "Relax, David, it'll be all right." I had been planning and worrying about how it was all going to unfold, but Anne was so reassuring, so supportive, so friend to friend in that discussion that it was very vivid. And it was in the final year of her life that she did this. And it was not an easy time for her to get all the way to Puerto Rico to do that. So it's unforgettable, that moment when we had that short exchange and her support was there in such a vivid and reassuring way to me. So I won't forget that. My presentation now is in a somewhat different direction from what Heather's was. I'll be a little bit less personal in what I'm going to say now. because I'd like to highlight a couple of issues that Anne raises in her work that have been particularly important to me. I'm thinking in particular of several essays in the book. One entitled Feminist Ethics in the New Millennium, The Dream of a Common Moral Language. The question of whether a common moral language across diverse cultures is feasible has been an issue that's been very important to me working in a setting here in the United States on human rights, where we talk about universal human rights, but also teaching in Nairobi, Kenya, where the culture is so different, and whether it's possible to have a common language across such cultural divides. And another essay in the book is entitled Markers, Barriers, and Frontiers, Theology in the Borderlands, raising the same sort of question. How do we deal across borders, across barriers between peoples from different traditions? So what I'd like to do is make a few comments about that issue of a common moral language. And I'd like to approach this question of across borders between diverse cultures by highlighting two distinctions. One, between how we reach across boundaries and borders persuasively versus how we might, in some circumstances, have to do so coercively. Persuasion and coercion. And how that set of distinctions might be related to the way we think about moral norms that are based on what might be understood to be truly basic human dignity versus moral norms based on understandings of concrete conditions of human dignity that are disputed between cultures. So basic dignity versus concrete conditions of dignity that are disputed. Now, I can apply these two distinctions that I've made here to two cases, just to illustrate them. Two cases that I talked about with Anne, but they are rather dramatic cases on which there is considerable argument and dispute, namely female genital mutilation or cutting, which is practiced in East Africa, where I have taught, and the rape of large numbers of women during the genocide that took place in Rwanda, a country that I visited just shortly after the genocide took place. How do we respond to issues like that? And the two distinctions I'd made, I'd like to apply to those cases. What I would like to suggest is that where basic human dignity is truly threatened, clearly so, such as in the case where many thousands of women were being raped in Rwanda during the genocide there, a response that might even be considered coercive can be justified. In other words, the non-intervention of the West, even the non-intervention by military force to prevent the genocide from occurring, I regard as a moral failure. Whereas on the other hand, where cultural disputes about concrete conditions of dignity are involved, it seems to me, and that I would argue is the case in the issue of female genital cutting, persuasion should be the response rather than coercion. Persuasive initiatives should arise, I would argue, out of what might be called accompaniment, a phrase that has come to mean a lot to me through my work with Jesuit Refugee Service that regards accompaniment of refugees as the very starting point of service and advocacy on their behalf. By listening to women in Kenya, I have learned that there are some people in Kenyan society, including some educated women, who believe that female genital cutting is justified and indeed is a legitimate and desirable form of initiating women or girls into full adult womanhood. We Westerners find this appalling, but Kenyans and some Kenyan women do not. What do we do in a circumstance like that? Listening has also shown me that some women in Kenya strenuously disagree with this practice. I myself am convinced that this process of female genital cutting has medical and psychological effects that mean that it should be abolished. But because not all Kenyan women agree with me on this, I have come to conclude that respect for the dignity of women in this circumstance means I should seek to change this practice through persuasion, not coercion, through an education-based approach that proceeds by invoking and trying to lead values to the fore in ways that might be different from simply saying, we're going to put you in jail if you do this. I believe this will enable this persuasive approach, educationally oriented, will reinforce the movement among Kenyan women to see that dignity is violated by this practice, but will do so in a way that is respectful of them. On the other hand, I think that protecting the truly basic human dignity of the Rwandan women who were massively and systematically raped during the Rwanda genocide justified intervention that might even have been coercive in that society. There is no doubt that a systematic campaign of rape was conducted during the Rwandan genocide. It was seen as one of the dimensions of seeking to wipe out the Tutsi people altogether by the attacks that were conducted by the Hutus of Rwanda. This violated the dignity of all those affected, the women in particular, but also the men who were killed in the process of the same events. I would want to argue that all cultures can agree on this. Indeed, it seems to me to be condescending, not only condescending, but wrong, to say that Rwandan culture supports genocide, or Rwandan culture supports the systematic rape of women. What happened there was clearly a moral distortion of Rwandan culture and a moral distortion of the commitments of the Rwandan people, not an expression of their culture. Therefore, respect for Rwandan people, and in particular respect for Rwandan women, could call upon us to say, we're going to stop this from happening. And I think that police and military action to prevent the genocide from taking place, including the systematic rape of women, would have been justified. What I'm suggesting, in other words, is that as we think about interventions across cultures and the quest for a common moral language, which was one of Anne's great concerns, these cases that I've suggested and the difference between coercion and persuasion can be important things to keep in mind. The challenges we face are not to say every culture can just do its own thing, people can do their own thing anywhere, and even if it leads to oppression of women in a very systematic way, we tolerate it. There are some aspects of how we deal with women in these circumstances that we should tolerate and deal with persuasively. others that seem to me we should deal with and say we're simply going to not let that happen and may move in a different direction. So what I'm suggesting, in other words, is that the struggles that Anne was engaged in looking for a common moral language and working across borders, although she didn't address these issues that I've talked about, we talked about them. And she, I think, was sympathetic to the fact that we need to make distinctions between different approaches to cultural difference and different ways of addressing disputes across borders. So I think that I learned from her in that regard, and I wish she were here to continue our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Leo Lefebure is the Matteo Ricci S.J. Professor of Theology here at Georgetown University. He is the author of True and Holy, Christian Scripture and Other Religions, and co-author of The Path of Wisdom, a Christian commentary on the Dhammapada. He is also the author of The Buddha and the Christ, and of Revelation, the Religions, and Violence. He is Vice President of the Society for Buddhist Christian Studies, Research Fellow of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Trustee Emeritus of the Council for Parliament of the World's Religions. Please welcome Leo Lefebure.
Thank you. One of the great gifts that Anne Patrick has given us was her continual effort to include those who were neglected and underrepresented, including groups that would not normally be considered in this category. My first contact with Anne came in the spring of 1989, when she was planning the convention of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and I was preparing to go to Japan. Both at that time and now, I would not usually be perceived as belonging to an underrepresented group. But Anne was concerned to include me in the convention as a representative of a population that she feared was less involved in the CTSA than in earlier years: priests teaching in Catholic seminaries. I was teaching at Mundelein Seminary of the University of St. Mary of the Lake near Chicago at the time, and our mutual friend Ann Carr, who had been my teacher at the University of Chicago, had told Anne about me. And so Anne Patrick phoned and asked if I would perform a role at the upcoming convention, but I had already made plans to go to Kyoto to work with the Buddhist thinker Masao Abe on a junior scholars grant, and so I wasn't able to accept her kind invitation. But I always remembered her thoughtfulness in reaching out to me. In recent years, almost every time when I would see Anne, she would invoke the name of Ann Carr, our beloved friend. And so in my mind, the memories of these two wonderful women are forever intertwined. I'm so blessed to have been graced by their presence in my life. Anne Patrick lived through momentous changes in the church and the world. Her early religious formation took place in the era before the Second Vatican Council, when formal theological training for Catholic women was just barely beginning. It seems shocking to us now that as a young woman religious, Anne was expected to teach long before she obtained her bachelor's degree. Anne's path to theology was marked by numerous obstacles and challenges. As Heather has noted, her traditional-minded superiors in religious life thought they needed to foster in her the virtue of humility and protect her from the danger of pride, and so they did not inform her of the accolades accorded to her early academic work. Nonetheless, she persevered both in carrying out her responsibilities and in obtaining advanced academic credentials in theology. The Second Vatican Council transformed the practice both of religious life and of Catholic theology. And another of Anne's great gifts to us is her interpretation and appropriation of the Second Vatican Council. In particular, the programmatic agenda of Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. Anne lived the famous opening sentence of Gaudium et Spes. She accepted it wholeheartedly as a program for the Christian life. as a woman who lived the virtues of joy and hope, and who repeatedly demonstrated concern for the sorrows and suffering of the poor and afflicted, and regularly looked for the unexplored good, and was sensitive to the law of unintended consequences. She loved Jesus' parable of the talents, and commented, I quote, "The investment of talents, whether 1 or 2 or 5, must happen with the awareness that one cannot fully predict the results of a deed undertaken in the hope of doing good," end quote. So she was acutely aware of the unfinished character of all of our lives and the unpredictability of their outcomes. Anne's reflections on Gaudium et Spes offer a window into her paths of thought and her concern for the church and the world. On the one hand, Anne was quite critical of this document and the patriarchal process that shaped its composition. She lamented that women were largely excluded from participation in the Second Vatican Council. And Riley noted that even when a text written by British economist Barbara Ward was read on the floor of the council, it was read by a man. Anne mourned the many limitations of the council and its documents regarding women in the church and the world. She critically observed that Gaudium et Spes continues the tradition of viewing women's roles primarily in relation to men. But she also probed the fissures of this male-composed document to see what openings there may be for further applications beyond the conscious expectations of its androcentric authors. So despite the text's many weaknesses, Anne emphasized the document's fundamental rejection of the tradition of misogyny in Christian anthropological reflections. She repeatedly cited Article 29 of Gaudium et Spes, which teaches the fundamental equality of all persons, male and female, and condemns any kind of social or cultural discrimination in personal rights on the grounds of sex. She also quoted Article 62 of this document, which invites lay people to study theology with a lawful freedom of inquiry, of thought, of expression, tempered by humility and courage in whatever branch of study they have specialized. These texts offered a launching pad for Anne's own theological reflections. Anne accepted the Council's affirmation of historical consciousness in discerning the will of God and becoming open to the genuinely new as a programmatic invitation to reflect further on the vocations of women in the church, the academy, and the world. For Anne, being a feminist theologian in a time of historical consciousness shaped a vocation inspired by the Second Vatican Council, but challenging her continually to move beyond it. As a woman of hope, Anne pondered the meaning of vocation for all people, stressing that Gaudium et Spes affirms the universal call to holiness. Beyond this general call, Anne rejoiced in what she saw as the invitation to focus love and creativity and sexual energy in a particular life context, and noted the call to productive secular activity where one's work becomes more than mere jobs. Of particular importance for our present moment, and challenged the limitations of Gaudium et Spes on our relation to the natural world, especially its repetition of traditional views of humankind's alleged superiority to nature and the supposed call to master and dominate nature. She pointed out the implicit violence in the project of subduing nature and noted the unresolved tension between this assumption and the more hopeful renunciation of violence elsewhere in Gaudium et Spes. Anne's comments, which were published originally in 1986, strikingly anticipate the concerns of Pope Francis in Laudato Si', especially his criticism of anthropocentrism and the resulting exploitative relationship to nature. Anne went on to caution against Gaudium et Spes' traditional view of women's alleged nature as somehow different from men's nature. She warned, when the document speaks of human nature in general, it stresses the element of mystery, the sense that God alone can supply the full answer to the question which each person is to oneself. When Gaudium et Spes speaks of women's nature, however, it conveys a sense of fixity that contrasts with an earlier reference to a dynamic and more evolutionary concept of nature in general. Anne found in the Second Vatican Council this unresolved tension. On the one hand, the Council Fathers viewed the vocation of women in very traditional terms. On the other hand, the Council's affirmation of the evolutionary character of nature, the open-ended dynamism of historical consciousness, the equality of women, and the universal call to holiness offer a basis for moving beyond the Council's limitations in light of a more adequate understanding of nature and history. And also pointed out that at times the Council rebukes the rest of society for discrimination against women, but it does not subject the Catholic Church to similar scrutiny in this area. And criticized the androcentric and non-inclusive language of the Council documents for excluding women. She warned of the effect of Gaudium et Spes' language of brotherhood in relation to love of neighbor. She commented, "As long as one does not see the specifics of female neighbors, so will one's neighbor love remain inadequate in their regard." She also lamented the Council's use of patriarchal language for God, with the attendant danger of taking too literally masculine language about God, as if it were somehow adequate. Anne took up the image of God as Sophia in the ministry of Jesus, as described by Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza and Elizabeth Johnson, and rejoiced in the attention that Gaudium et Spes gives to the Holy Spirit in bringing hope and shaping genuine communities of justice and love. She saw the power of the Spirit inspiring and animating the development of feminist theology, focused on Sophia and concerned for justice and equality in harmony with all creation. Now, Gaudium et Spes openly acknowledged limitations and failures of Catholic practice in its confession that Catholics bore partial responsibility for the rise of modern atheism because they had not always witnessed to the gospel very effectively, and applied this practice pointedly to the Catholic Church's treatment of women, and saw the best principles of Gaudium et Spes as critiquing its limitations and setting the agenda for a thoroughgoing renewal of Catholic life, practice, and theology. She cited feminist scholars who read between the lines of historical documents, and she practiced a similar hermeneutic on Gaudium et Spes. She commented, "We need no less than a revolution of Catholic consciousness. A profound conversion is called for, a shift of attention, a turning from certain preoccupations to new topics and new ways of seeing old ones." For all her criticisms of the Catholic Church, and despite her disappointment with its male leadership in many regards, she remained deeply loyal to the best of the Catholic tradition and asked herself how best to balance her ideals with a realism about institutional church structures, and accepted the agenda of Gaudium et Spes to read the signs of the times, and so she was constantly surveying currents of thought and practice. She recognized that a global church calls for repeated crossing of boundaries and combining local and global concerns in what she hoped would be a chastened form of frontier spirit. Among the signs of the times that she noted were those who reject all institutional structures of religion and seek to be secular or spiritual but not religious. Anne understood their frustrations with institutional structures of religion, but she combined a fierce criticism of injustice with a deep concern to change the institutions of the Catholic Church. And she thought criticisms of religion could be overstated. And so she chided Karl Marx for missing cases where religion was a force in resisting oppression. And she thought both Karl Marx and Mary Daly overlooked the positive contributions of Catholics to shaping society. While she understood the concerns of those who sought to be spiritual but not religious, Anne maintained a Catholic fidelity to the need for shared narratives and structures and rituals, and called above all for balance. In proposing an ethics of spirituality inspired by the vision of Gaudium et Spes, Anne prized critical fidelity and called for balance among self-care and solidarity and humility, all in service of the common good. Anne left us a beautiful expression of her fundamental faith and confidence that was the basis for her joy and hope. So as we thank God for the gift that Anne was in our lives, I would like to close my remarks today by giving the final word to her as she tells us, "The world and the church are not the same today as they were 50 or even 10 years ago. But some things do not change. And one of these is God's faithfulness and care for all her people, especially those who are poor and disadvantaged. God is acting in history to bring to full realization the values of her realm, and much of that activity is hidden from sight. And marvelously, we are part of that activity." Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Our last speaker today is Susan A. Ross, Professor of Theology and Faculty Scholar at Loyola University, Chicago. She received her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago, where she and Anne became friends, colleagues, and along with Anne's sister Maureen, who is here, Anne Carr, bridge partners. She is the author of Estrangement Affections. I'm sorry, I'm needing my glasses, so Extravagant Affections, a feminist sacramental theology, For the Beauty of the Earth, Women, Sacramentality, and Justice, and Anthropology, Seeking Light and Beauty. She's a past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, a member of the Concilium editorial board, and is also an avid amateur pianist, an avocation she also shared with her friend Anne, and also she shares with Leo. So please, welcome Susan Ross.
Thank you. I'm very, very happy to have been asked to speak on this occasion of honoring Anne's book, On Being Unfinished. I was unable to be at her memorial service, so when Anne's sister Mary asked me to come for this occasion, I could not say no. So again, thank you very much. And this, again, is a memorable trip here. My very first trip to Georgetown was in 1963 for my father's 20th Georgetown reunion. So I want to talk about Anne Patrick and her lifelong concern with conscience. But first, I want to frame my remarks with a couple of observations about Anne herself. Like Heather, I'm going to be including some of those personal notes. One is to note Anne's meticulous scholarship, and I think this has already been noted. This is evident in all of her essays here and in her other books and articles. When I was working on my theological anthropology book about 6 or 7 years ago, Anne offered to read a draft of it. So I sent a draft to Anne, and she returned it filled with comments, suggestions, and I must say when I looked at the comments that she sent back, I thought, oh no. But when I went over what she had to say, I realized that she was helping me to make it even better, because I thought I was a pretty good writer, but she was a better one. She did not do anything halfway at all. So I feel a special responsibility to make my own remarks as careful and thoughtful as Anne would expect. The second thing to note has to do with the wide range of issues that Anne wrote and spoke about so courageously and about which we've heard already. Literature and ethics, of course, but the range of issues within them is really amazing. Contemporary plays and novels, as well as 19th century ones, so many of the controversial issues in Catholic moral theology, women religious, social justice. But what sticks with me is the sense that Anne was unafraid to address the issues she encountered. A lesser person might think that he or she was perhaps not the right person to say something about a controversial issue. Something might be a stretch. so that perhaps she couldn't say anything really profound, or that maybe she wasn't, I'm thinking of myself here sometimes, maybe not the right scholar to do this. But Anne had a confidence and even a boldness about her voice that I always admired and even envied. It might have been because she was the oldest of 6. I am the third of 6, a typical middle child who likes to please. So that, for Anne, when faced with something like giving the presidential address for the Catholic Theological Society in 1990, she made the bold decision to have everyone sit in small groups at tables and addressed very straightforwardly the concerns that some had raised, which Leo just mentioned, about the composition and the changing makeup of the society. We who are CTSA members owe a great deal to Anne for her hard work in changing the organization, the format of the meetings, and leading the society to new challenges. And there was really, the whole society really changed under her. But when Anne made a decision to do something or say something, she spoke confidently, clearly, and boldly. She was not rash. As I recall, she was advised not to sign the famous 1984 New York Times ad about there being a variety of views about abortion by American Catholics, because at that time she wasn't tenured. And she took that advice, but it was done thoughtfully. So these qualities of what I call courage and carefulness are also characteristic of her writings on conscience, and are also excellent ways to think and act about conscience in the present. As we know, conscience was an abiding concern of Anne's, from her dissertation dealing with George Eliot and H. Richard Niebuhr, to her first 3 books, all of which dealt with conscience: Liberating Conscience, Women, Conscience and the Creative Process, Conscience and Calling. It's funny that this is the one book that doesn't have conscience in the title. And the chapter on conscience in this volume comes from her Madaleva lecture, where many of us here were present, and it serves to highlight the importance of an understanding of conscience that does justice to its complexity and its importance. Now, in Catholic moral theology, conscience plays a very important role. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says, and I quote its words, "Conscience is a judgment of reason, whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act that he is going to perform, is in the process of performing, or has already completed. In all he says and does, man is obliged to follow faithfully what he knows to be just and right. It is by the judgment of his conscience that man perceives and recognizes the prescriptions of the divine law." Now let's compare that with Anne's own definition in Liberating Conscience. It is personal moral awareness experienced in the course of anticipating future situations and making moral decisions, as well as in the process of reflecting on one's past decisions and the quality of one's character, that is, the sort of person one is becoming. Now, I don't think Anne would have any major problem with the official definition, other than its exclusive language, which many of us know was not in the original English version. It was originally translated inclusively, but then retranslated exclusively. But Anne's emphasis here is telling. What is the sort of person we are becoming? This is not so much a question of following rules, but of being aware of and reflective about one's journey as a person. There is a more holistic sense of conscience that Anne emphasizes that she learned both from her literary sources as well as from the writings of both Catholic and Protestant ethicists. The epigraph to the first chapter of Liberating Conscience quotes the mother of Reverend Fairbrother, one of the characters in Middlemarch, and she says, "When I was young, there was never any question of right or wrong. We knew our catechism and that was enough. We learned our creed and our duty. Every respectable church person had the same opinions." Much the same could have been said of pre-Vatican II Catholic moral theology, which is precisely why Anne included this quote in the book. Anne observes there and in this chapter that conscience includes appropriate conformity to law, but also a willingness to take appropriate risks. So, as she says, there are passive ways of being a person of conscience, that is, following the prescriptions of the divine law, but also creative ways that involve taking one's own intelligence and experience seriously in relation to the challenges one faces. For Anne, it was especially important that women exercise conscience creatively because, as she observed in many of her writings, women were less likely to be in positions where it was possible to exercise power or engage in original thinking. So it was especially significant that she paid close attention to women who did just this. So I'd like to talk about two examples of how Anne put her thinking on conscience to work in her approach to women who set themselves outside the church in deliberate ways. In chapter 13 of On Being Unfinished, she describes the influence of the School of Sacred Theology established by Sister Madaleva Wolff, for whom the lecture series was named, at St. Mary's College, of which Mary is a graduate, which had a powerful impact on many women theologians, and this is in the 40s and 50s, by giving them the possibility of doctoral education in theology. Mary Daly, the radical post-Christian feminist philosopher, received her first doctorate from St. Mary's, and then she went on to have a distinguished, if not also controversial, career at Boston College after obtaining another doctorate at the University of Fribourg. In 1978, Mary Daly's book, Gyne/Ecology, The Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism, was published. Anne had been asked to do a review of it, but for whatever reason, she had too much on her plate, or perhaps she thought a younger fellow student might benefit from reading the book. She gave it to me and said that she thought it would be a good thing for me to do a review. And as I said in my essay, because I wrote about this in a series called Take and Read that was published in the National Catholic Reporter, the book changed me forever. I could never look at the Christian tradition in quite the same way again. Now, I'm pretty sure that I gave my review to Anne, and she reviewed it carefully. I think it was my very first publication. And what I think is important to note is Anne's both taking this book utterly seriously and also using it as an educational opportunity for her friend and fellow student. Many people then and now dismissed Daly for her radical ideas. She did not allow men in her classes at BC, although she offered to tutor them privately. She declared Christianity and all patriarchal religions to be necrophilic, that is, death-loving, and she rejected any position of compromise. But what Anne saw in Mary Daly was a courageous and creative mind, someone who in her work was really central to feminist theology. Anne asks in the chapter in this book, if Mary Daly, and I quote, had not studied Thomas Aquinas so assiduously at St. Mary's College, would she have been able to hold her own as the only female in a sea of cassocked seminarians at the University of Fribourg? She asks whether her books would have been published or whether Christian feminist theology would have taken a different course. So Anne's connecting Sister Madaleva with Mary Daly and feminist theology is a great example of how she made creative connections in her work and paid attention to those that others might have ignored or rejected. I think this is because she saw Mary Daly as someone who followed her own conscience very creatively. And if you've read any of the later Mary Daly, very creatively, and in her own gynocentric way, allowed others, like me, to think creatively as well. Another example of Anne's attention to often overlooked groups is how seriously she pays attention to what she calls the small but influential reform movement known as Roman Catholic women priests. As she notes in her book, Conscience and Calling, the movement has been criticized by both the right and the left. The right, because of the group's clear violation of official Catholic teaching, and the left, because of the group's insistence on holding to traditional clerical structures. Anne lays out in the chapter, couldn't resist going to another one of her books, so she lays out in that chapter the history of the movement, how it has grown, and information from its 2012 Constitution. And as she concludes that section of the chapter, she quotes Acts 5, 38 to 39, where Gamaliel comments on the early Jesus movement by saying, "For if this idea of theirs or its execution is of human origin, it will collapse. But if it is from God, you will never be able to put it down." Now, I think Anne is one of the very few feminist theologians to take this group very seriously and on its own terms. She sees both creativity and fidelity in their efforts. That movement is definitely on the margins of Catholicism. Some would say they're nowhere near the margins, but very far over there. But Anne's perceptive eye allowed her to see in this movement another example of the liberated and creative conscience. There are many other examples of Anne's attention to women's creative exercise of conscience, particularly in the stories she tells of women religious and their struggles with religious authority. Who can forget the words of the sister who told Anne in an interview, "Father cared more about his dogs than about us." Nevertheless, she raises up this group of Holy Name sisters who worked tirelessly for their parish despite their pastor's utter lack of any sensitivity or set of priorities. The many powerful stories of the creative and courageous consciences of women religious that Anne brought to light in so much of her work not only challenges the stereotypical picture of the nun as the good sister or even as the adorable team mascot, but also, and if you know Sister Jean, you would know she's no cute little sister, but also it really puts the work of women religious in its proper context. So I want to conclude by saying how much I owe to Anne. I've been inspired to teach a senior honors capstone course twice on conscience and have used Anne's work in the work of other feminist theologians in the course, including my colleague David. My students have benefited from her work, and so her influence continues. Anne embodied the best of what the Christian tradition says about conscience. It needs to be informed, and so one must do one's homework, know the tradition, and pay close attention to what the authorities say. But one must also act responsibly, with full awareness of the situation, creatively, with the full exercise of one's imagination, and with confidence as a full moral agent. Anne's carefulness and responsibility as a teacher, scholar, and friend, not to mention daughter, sister, and aunt, along with her confidence and courage, continues to inspire me, and I know others as well. So, as we mark Anne's 77th birthday today, I am grateful for our friendship and all that I have learned from her. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Well, 5 excellent presentations, and we have some time for some questions. And there's a microphone, so if you could please raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and also identify yourself. Don't be shy. Please stand, and they'll bring a microphone to you.
I wanted to ask Pat Pericchini, if she would, to talk about Anne in the last year or so before she died. Is that an okay question?
That's a little difficult. I've known Anne since I was 9 years old. We rode bikes together in 4th grade, so I have so many different connections with her. As a friend of her family, as a high school teacher who took over right after she started to study full-time at Maryland University for her master's in literature. And then we're also theological colleagues from the Catholic Theological Society. So many interconnections, but probably the most privileged time was this last year in accompanying her. And particularly just maybe to highlight one story about Puerto Rico, since David mentioned that. Anne really wanted to go to Puerto Rico. She wanted to go basically to say goodbye to her colleagues, and she knew this was really near the end. You have to remember the meeting was in June. In mid-June, we got home on the 15th, and she died July 21st. So we're talking a woman with a spine of steel. When we got to Puerto Rico, it was a very difficult trip. That was when she started to show signs of the brain tumor. And she could actually barely walk during the whole meeting at the Catholic Theological Society. But she was determined to do as much as she could, so she did 1 or 2 things a day, made plans with friends, had dinner each night with a different person that she really wanted to do her goodbyes with. Long story short, I mean, it was a poignant time. People had a chance to say things to her that they needed to say. David knows that. She allowed people to reach out to her, which to me is a sign of the character she wrote about so much. That her ability to receive during that week from close colleagues and friends in her very, very frail condition was just unbelievable gift to many of them. People came to me and said a lot of this. So I think I want to just focus on that, the commitment, the faithfulness, the awareness of God's faithfulness to her was really present in that meeting and in that time. 3 of us spent a few days afterward at a condo overlooking the ocean because she really loved to swim and loved the ocean. She was unable to do anything basically but look out the window and watch the water. But she was so thrilled to be able to do there. And 2 of us, Charlie Curran and I, were able to walk her over to a restaurant across the street. And one night, Susan and her husband came and joined us. And you would think that she was at the Ritz, you know, with this tiny little restaurant that probably got destroyed in the hurricane, I'm thinking, because it was right on the water. So just so much joy in the moment, trying to put a positive face on this difficult journey. You know, she never wanted to use the term fighting cancer. She could not stand that terminology. I don't want people to describe my journey as fighting cancer. She found it a difficult thing, but it wasn't a fight. She wanted to kind of work with it, if you know what I mean, and focus on how her treatment could help other people. So I'm just, if I say anything more, I won't be able to get through it, but I just want to affirm everything. The panelists, you captured her so beautifully in my experience of Anne. She was just a beautiful person. Thank you.
Leo, did you want to respond?
Yes, thank you. She had a remarkable ability to reveal herself without any selfishness. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I suggest that you pay attention to the whole thing. It's beautifully written. She just wrote gracefully, also gently. There's never any pushiness. Strong argument, but nothing argumentative. The unusual quality of balance. But she had an ability to talk about herself without talking about herself. So it was self-revelatory, but not selfish. And I think that was part of that ability was one of the things that helped her to keep anger far, far away and resentment. I mean, imagine if your superior told you, you know, you were very, very smart, but we thought it'd be bad for you to know that. Wouldn't you think of joining another team? Like play for the Yankees, where they at least will give you more money. But that was maybe helpful in the lead up to her last very frail year. And I don't know how to understand it except as a graced gift that she had this this ability. So many of the stories about herself are in footnotes. And unlike many footnotes, they're not boring. They're really worth reading.
Any other question? There's a question over there. Oh, I'm sorry, Susan.
I was just going to make one small comment that during Anne's sisters and sisters in many senses of the word, and the family knows this, that during her illness, she was so fascinated by the treatment itself. She wanted to learn as much as possible about it, so that she was this very informed patient in that sense. But she would learn as much as she could and talk about, you know, the various treatments. And so it was an intellectual issue. It was not just, you know, I have to deal with this terrible illness, but she really wanted to understand as much about it as she could.
There's a question over there.
I wanted to comment also that I was one of Anne's doctors for the last 2 years of her life, and I was so moved, not just by knowing her, but the expression that Pat presented about her not fighting cancer. She was a healer, and she was so incredibly informed and knowledgeable, but she was truly she was a team player in terms of her journey, and I can't tell you how much I learned from her, and was so moved by the 2 years that I knew her and celebrated the publication of the book preceding this. But it's important for me to share the fact that she had to have been the patient that I have learned so much from, and I just truly loved her. I thought she was such a marvelous human being. She really was a gift that the only thing, my office couldn't stand it when she came, because they said, you know, you spend so much time talking to her. You're get us so behind. Would you please? Just like they said, we're just going to put her at the end of the day. But I'm so grateful that you all congregated here and to be here today.
Thank you so much for that. I think that might, Mary, did you want to speak? Oh, a microphone, please.
I do have a question, and I'm trying to figure out how to actually formulate it. But I've had the advantage of having Anne at my table. And I made comment that she was a theologian in residence. So anytime we had a question or an issue we wanted to explore, we would just let Aunt Anne in on it, and she would help us through. And my children know that she really enjoyed when they brought their friends home, and she got them to tell stories they would never have told in front of us. But one thing that I take from reading the book and reading other pieces of her work, she has so much hope, and so much hope she had so much hope in the 1950s and 1960s, and the day she died, she had so much hope for the future. What advice do each of you have for those of us who are not scholars, we're not teachers, we're in our own little world? What can we take either from your experience or her experience to go out and to be hopeful for the world and to help, I guess, further her mission? I guess that's, I don't know if that, is that too broad a question?
Thank you.
I'd just say one thing.
David?
I mean, one thing that always touched me deeply about Anne was there was always a sense of some deep level of joy and peace in her. And I think from that, all kinds of other things happened, that she could engage in discussions and debates and even arguments with people, but do it in a way that was peaceful and touched by joy. And so, I don't know whether we try to bring things out to the larger world from the domain of theology inside the church. Whatever the church has got to be, it's got to be a sign of hope and joy to people. And if it doesn't do that, it's not going to persuade anybody. And Anne showed me that in a very personalized way.
Leo?
Yeah. For me, it's that line that I quoted at the very end of my remarks. It's from one of the very last lectures she gave. It's in the book. But that just encapsulated it to me in terms of the reason for her joy and hope. It was this deep confidence, despite all the obstacles that she was very aware of, all the suffering of people that she was very aware of. The power of God is at work, sometimes subtle, sometimes unseen. There's always the law of unintended consequences. You know, what we sow, somebody else will reap. So we're part of this much broader, deeper process. But God is there in and through it all.
Well, and I would just add to that kind of to pick up on what I said before, she took everything very seriously, but she wasn't, I mean, this was a thing that my husband actually said about Anne Carr that I think is true of Anne Patrick as well. She pondered deeply, but she was never ponderous. You know, that there was a depth there, but there was always a way of dealing with it that was interested, that was curious, that could be playful about it. And so there was a depth, but it was never the sort of heavy or totally serious, because I remember my first year at Loyola, after I had been at 2 other schools and kind of gone back to Chicago, but it was a different city. I didn't know the people in my department. It was very lonely. And I remember talking with Anne that December in 1985 and saying, I don't like this. I think I'm going to go back to being a stockbroker. You know, this was just, I just don't like my colleagues, you know, and Anne just said, oh, Susan, she said, you take this too seriously. She said, now you know that it's just moving is hard, it's going to take you a while, and you know, she was absolutely right. So she listened seriously, but she was, you know, she refused to sort of get bogged down by my too seriousness and to see that there are other possibilities. And so I think that's a dimension of her hope, that there was this hopefulness, and she had a great sense of humor. You did not want to play her in Scrabble. No, because she would win. But so she was really serious about some things, but she never took herself or life too seriously. So I think that's a good example for all of us.
I was going to repeat what I'd said about challenges before, but maybe I could expand it by thinking of 2 of the ways Anne met challenges. She had a deep sense of family, recognizing how many different kinds of families there were. I remember, for example, how she dealt with the death by cancer of her sister Peggy, her concern for the children of the family, for Peggy's husband. But obviously that was one of many families she belonged to, and I think one reason she was so happy at Carleton was the Carleton faculty, was in many senses a family. The other thing I would add is an important corollary to what we've said about hope. She had hope without blind fooling herself about anything. I mean, I remember she told me very shortly after the cancer diagnosis, she thought she probably had a few years to live at that point. And I think her doctors had been realistic with her without giving false hope, but they also had said, treatments are changing, you may have a lot of time. So she balanced all of that with the realism that enabled the hope.
Okay. Thank you. And there are many people to thank for this event taking place. First and foremost is Susan Perry. Where's Sue Perry?
Susan stand.
Please stand. So Sue Perry was a senior editor at Orbis Books for 25 years, and she worked on hundreds of books, particularly in the areas of ethics, feminist theology, and African and Asian theology. She's now retired, although still working occasionally for Orbis, and she lives in Philadelphia. And she also brought this book together and worked so hard on it, and it's really because of her work in this book that we're all here. So thank you so much, Sue.
Thank you.
I want to thank the panel. If I could just say a couple of words.
Can you just wait for a microphone one more time, please? Thank you.
I want to thank the panel, first of all, for highlighting what is wonderful about Anne and what is wonderful about the book. When Anne called me first to ask if I would be interested in working with her on a collection of her writings, I felt truly honored. I'd known her for years and felt she was a friend and someone whose work I respected greatly. But Anne persevered. This project was very, very important to her. And even we collaborated. We were back and forth on the phone for a long time. And then even when Anne was in the final stages, especially after the CTSA meeting in Puerto Rico, when she was no longer able to really have a coherent sentence come out, she cared about the book. And unfortunately, Anne died before it was finished, but I was able, because of Anne's hard work and her commitment, to carry it through to the end. And even at the end, when Anne really couldn't talk, she dictated notes to Mary to do introductions. She so wanted to write an introduction to each of the pieces in the book that would highlight its importance to her. And fortunately, through Mary and then the intervention of Heather, we were able to incorporate those last notes that Anne had dictated to Mary, because she couldn't write and she couldn't get out an entire sentence. But it all happened. And I'm so grateful for the help of the family and for everyone on the panel for really highlighting Anne's work. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank, on behalf of all of us and the organizers, the many co-sponsors for this event. First of all, to the President's Office. Riggs Library is a very special place on this campus, and not anyone gets to use it, so I think it speaks to Anne and to her importance. Also, the Georgetown Women's Alliance, the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Georgetown University Women's Center, the Office of Mission and Ministry, Catholic Chaplaincy, the Department of Theology, and the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary, and Orbis Books. So thank you to all the co-sponsors for making this possible.